Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this open seminar hosted by the Center for Small State Studies and the EU Info Center in cooperation with the Institute of Public Administration and Politics and the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland. This seminar is part of the Center's Small States Summer School, now hosted for the 12th time. As you can see in the audience, we have a particularly good slice of young and highly motivated students, all, all participating in our summer school. They are undergraduate and graduate students, mostly from Europe, but some are here from as far away as China, and others from as close as the Faroe Islands and Greenland. The aim of the seminar today is to look at small states and governance, mainly from a European perspective, but also with a close look at Iceland in the aftermath of the financial crisis or crash in 2008. We have gathered a group of eminent scholars in the field, and for the next 3.5 hours, we will be discussing administrative reforms in Norway, special arrangements in Liechtenstein, small state influence with the European Commission, and we'll take a closer look at Malta's experience as a small state within the EU. Our moderator today is Hólmfríður Garðarsdóttir, but before she takes over, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Philos Per Lagreit is professor in public administration and organization theory at the University of Bergen. Lagreit is a well-known scholar in international public administration research. He has published widely in learned international journals and elsewhere, stayed at some of the best universities of the world, and is an active participant in international political science, public administration, international collaboration. Per will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will have some minutes left for questions and answers. The title of his talk is Administrative Reforms Seen from the Top, Norway in a European Perspective. It's an honor and pleasure indeed to have you with us today, Per, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been to Iceland, I think, 4 or 5 times before, but never to the Center for Small State Studies. So it's really a big pleasure to be here. Well, I will in 20 minutes or so try to give you some new data about what's happening in Europe. What's happening in Europe when it comes to public management reform, what is the content of the reforms, what are the perceived effects, how can we understand the reform and changes, and what are the main differences between countries. So I want to describe the dominant public management reform trends and how civil servants assess the use of management tools within the public sector in Norway, and comparing it to other European countries based on the big European project that is just coming to an end. How do administrative executives in ministries and central agencies assess the impacts of and relevance of reforms like new public management and other public sector reform trends, and what are the main trends in Norway compared to other European countries. So, how does this work?
Well, if it doesn't, I can.
Okay. The next supermodel. I think a year ago or so, you could see this on the front page of The Economist. I'm afraid that there was not much about Iceland there, but a lot of Sweden and Denmark and Norway, and why the world should look at the Nordic countries was the message in The Economist. So that's some kind of a background for this. So when we are discussing administrative reform and modernization of public administration and public government, there are actually three main issues that's up on stage. The first is the normative issue. How big should the public administration be? How should we draw the borders between the public administration, private sector, and civil society? I will not talk so much about that. The second question, and that's the question about administrative capacity or governance capacity, the outcome and effectiveness of public policy, efficiency, mainly. New public management is focusing a lot on efficiency, how to get more efficient public administrative apparatus. So a lot of the reforms and modernizations that's going on is discussing this or addressing this capacity issue, implementation power. And we also have to remember that we are dealing with representative democracies here. So it's also an issue of governance representativity. Is public policy representative for the citizens' demand? This is about the citizens' effectiveness and legitimacy. And I don't know, I guess studying small states, you might have read the book by Dahl and Tufte, Size and Democracy. And they are exactly discussing this trade-off between governance capacity on the one hand and governance representativity on the other hand. Big units tend to strengthen capacity and weaken the representativity, and the other way around. So we are dealing with very interesting tensions and dilemmas when we are discussing administrative reforms. And in Norway now, for instance, we have a big discussion about merging municipalities. They want to go down from 429 municipalities to 100. And the argument is that then the municipality will become more efficient. The governance capacity will increase. But the question is then what happens with the representativity? So that's important to keep in mind when we are discussing these kind of issues. And when it comes to administrative reforms over the past decades, we can in a way talk about traditional public administration, coordination by hierarchy, and authority, instruction and command. That's the old Weberian way of thinking of public administration. And then new public management came along from the mid-1980s, starting with Reagan and Thatcher and so on, and moving around from country to country, focusing on market and performance management, single-purpose organizations, and incentives, exchange and competition. And now, whole of government is more upfront. How to connect the dot, how to make the fragmentation produced by new public management into a more integrated and coherent public administrative system, focusing a lot on issues of horizontal coordination and multi-level governance and so on. And what about Scandinavia then in this picture? What's the Scandinavian model? Is there a Scandinavian model? And what is the content of this model in case? And we normally have two main doctrines for governance in Scandinavia. That's a ministerial responsibility and local self-government. And that makes something is very good about this and something is very problematic when we have these two kind of steering doctrines, because ministerial responsibility strengthens vertical coordination and control within the ministerial area, but have big problems to coordinate across horizontal coordination across policy areas. And local self-government tend to make coordination good within the municipal area, but big problems when coordinating across state and local government, and so on and so forth. I don't think I can have time to go into all these kind of characteristics, traditional characteristics of the Scandinavian model. It might be that no financial crisis doesn't fit so well with Iceland, of course. But with Norway, as I come back to, it really makes a big difference from the rest of European countries. So what I will give you some data from is this COCOPS project, taking stock of administrative reforms in Europe, a big European project funded by the European 7th Framework Program, and we had just the ending conference in Leuven 3 weeks ago, 11 universities in 10 European countries. And in this big project, we had a survey to the top civil servants in these 10 countries and have their attitudes and perception about what's going on. So the database is then this survey in 2012 and 13. It started with the core project groups of 10 countries, as you can see here. But after that, other affiliated countries has joined in. So now also Iceland is part of this big survey project, together with Sweden and Finland. So we have all 5 Nordic countries on board, making it possible to do very interesting comparative studies, which we just have started on, and unfortunately have not very much data on Iceland here, because Iceland was really one of the latest countries that joined into this, and the data is brand new. So what's some data? One interesting thing here when we are comparing European countries is that the executive autonomy is very high in countries like Scandinavian countries. There is a lot of autonomy given to the administrative apparatus, very much in contrast. So this is the first indication that's a big north-south divide in Europe. In Northern Europe, a lot of trust, a lot of autonomy for the bureaucracy. In contrast, you see on the bottom here, Italy, Portugal, Spain, typically very little autonomy. So that's one very interesting and important difference in Europe, European public administration. And the other one is the degree of politicization. And this is the opposite, you can see. Here the Mediterranean countries are up front, and the Scandinavian countries are on the bottom. So you have an interesting combination of scoring high on autonomy and low on politicization in Scandinavia. So there is not very much interference from the political executive in what the administration is doing, and the politicians normally trust the civil servants' expertise in Scandinavia to a much higher degree than in other countries. So what kind of reforms do we then have in these countries? And transparency, digital e-government, collaboration, performance management, reducing red tape and internal bureaucracy. You can see the management tools are very popular or very much used. And somewhat surprising to me, at least, privatization, which there has been a lot of talk about, is not very common. And you see, they are also trying to differentiate here between Norway and the other countries. And the main picture is that the dominant reform trends in Norway are pretty similar to the dominant reform trend in the rest of Europe, with one important exception, as you can see here: public sector downsizing. Doesn't happen in Norway. but it's very important in the Mediterranean countries, for instance, and has a big impact on the motivation and how the top civil servants actually assess the situation. Yeah, downsizing. So here you can say that the exceptional case of Norway, in contrast to like France and UK and other countries. That's actually a very important difference in this material. And unfortunately, we don't have Iceland in here, but I would guess that downsizing is much more dominant in Iceland than in Norway due to the financial crisis. And then we move on to some kind of reform tools. I can't go into them in detail either, but you can see here that management tools are pretty popular and very much used. And even so, more so actually in Norway than many other countries. Staff appraisal is mandatory. Strategic planning, management by objective and results, as we call it in Norway, performance management systems, codes of conduct. A lot of these new public management tools has been integrated into the way the administrative apparatus works. So a general finding is that management tools seems to be part of everyday work life within the public administration, both in Norway and rest of Europe. The implementation dynamics is interesting when we look to Norway comparing to other countries. What we see here is may be a bit difficult to understand that table, but it shows that the reforms in Norway, it's much less top-down. There are much more involvement and from stakeholders in Norway and participation. The Norwegian reforms are more comprehensive and less partial. They are not too demanding compared to many other, and they are seen as more successful, and there is high public involvement in Norway compared to many other countries. And they are more about service improvement than about cost cutting, which is much more dominant in many other countries. So the implementation profile of the reforms in Norway have some specific characteristics, which also have consequences of how successful they are. This is a combination of success and demanding, how demanding the reforms are. And here actually we have Iceland in EIS. So in Iceland, the reforms are not demanding enough, the top civil servants say, but they are also rather unsuccessful. In Norway, on the other hand, they are successful, and also in Norway, not that demanding. So there is an interesting distinction there. And also here we can see some kind of Norway as some kind of deviant case. The success of the reforms is because they are focusing more on service improvement than on cost cutting. And here Norway is some kind of an outlier in a European context. And the same is a bit the case when it looks on public involvement. Integrated participation from stakeholders, civil service unions and others in the reform processes seems also to be connected to the success of the reforms in a way. The higher the public involvement is, the more successful the reform seems to be. Then about the effects. Overall development, improvement and deterioration. Denmark, that seems to be a very success case. Netherlands, Ireland, Sweden, Estonia, Norway. But when you come down here to Ireland, Serbia, United Kingdom, Spain, they seems to go down the drain compared to the northern European countries. So again, we see this this interesting development. And here, I think Iceland is also included. Yeah. So in Iceland, 29% say, well, it's improvement, but almost as many say it has really been worse. So it is a very different opinion, I think, about this in Iceland. But in contrast to Norway, the Norwegian top civil servant seems to be much more positive about the development than in Iceland. Well, I think we are running out of time, but I would like to maybe look at this slide, because here you can see some very interesting differences between Norway and Iceland, especially if you look at this one, citizens' trust in government. You see Norway on the top of the list, and Iceland is almost on the bottom. So something has happened in Iceland after the financial crisis. Even the top civil servants think that the citizens' trust in government has become much worse than it used to be before. And I think that's one very interesting observation here, that the financial crisis might have this kind of effect. And when we look at the other one, staff motivation and attitudes toward the work, well, there's also Iceland included, and that's not that bad. So they are pretty motivated, but they think that the citizens don't trust them anymore. So, and in Norway again comes on the top of the list when it comes to staff motivation, and also of course probably linked to the issue of financial crisis. Transparency and openness, attractiveness, satisfaction with work. I think we are also there. You can see this kind of motivation and satisfaction is very, in a way, high. So Norway is scoring pretty high on these kind of dimensions. Coordination is one very interesting problem in public administration. So I've been working especially on that issue of horizontal and vertical coordination, especially these kind of wicked issues when the problem structure is not following the organization structure, like internal security and unemployment, poverty, climate issues, and that kind of thing. These public administrative system is running into a lot of problems, especially the horizontal coordination is very weak. You are not able to coordinate across ministerial areas. So there are very weak horizontal coordination across policy areas. Even if coordination reforms are important and new instruments are introduced, the results are very mixed, and people are really thinking that these kind of coordination tools like networks and partnerships that are popping up in the shadow of the hierarchy, they are not working very well, and almost 1/3 say that, well, it's even worse now than it used to be. And I think that's because these kind of wicked issues, these transboundary issues, are more upfront now than they used to be, and there are a lot of struggles of how to organize to handle these kind of cross-boundary policy areas. So, Norwegian differences: more autonomy, as I said, especially regarding recruitment and promotion and policy implementation, less politicization, scoring strong on transparency and openness, e-government is high on the agenda, ethical guidelines are mandatory, hierarchy is still strong. Even after many decades of new public management reforms, hierarchy is still the strongest and most important coordination mechanism in the governmental apparatuses. Network supplements hierarchy as a coordinating mechanism, but it definitely doesn't replace hierarchy. The reforms are more consistent and less symbolic. They are less top-down, more collaborative with civil service union, more participation from stakeholders, more consultation and collaboration, which I think is very different from the Scandinavian countries compared to the Mediterranean countries. The administrative culture there is very different. Scoring low on privatization, contracting out and downsizing, and so on and so forth. But still people are a bit uncertain and a bit ambiguity when it comes to the impact of the reforms. So we face some kind of a paradox, as mentioned at the end here. The reforms are very popular, but it looks like that they don't need success to go on. They really don't need clear results to go on. So there is some kind of ideology here, that are running these kind of reforms, even if it's very hard to find very strong, reliable evidence, for instance, that the efficiency has improved. The reforms are very popular anyway. And that's a paradox, because all these kind of reforms have built their legitimacy on efficiency arguments. This is the main difference, I would say, between Norway and the rest of Europe, and linked to the financial crisis. Pay cut, pay freeze, increased user fees, almost absent. Downsizing, dismissals are very rare in Norway. And this is quite a very different picture than what we see in countries like Spain, Portugal, and France, and Italy, and also UK. So it's some kind of a success story. High on trust and social capital, less reduction in social cohesion. Top civil servants are more positive, motivated, satisfied compared to the rest of Europe. And the government is an attractive employer. Looks fine, huh? More positive attitudes regarding the public administration functioning in future. They are, in a way, in a very good mood. And how can we explain this? Well, I think the most obvious thing is that there is no financial crisis in Norway, so, well, that's why. But I think that's only part of the story, because also in Norway we started from, this is a very high trust context. So there was a high trust in government and a high trust in a big universal welfare state. It's not the case in Norway, like in US, for instance, where Reagan said, well, you know, government is not the solution, it's the problem. In Norway, people love the state. And when they have problems, they run to the state, and the state is supposed to solve them for them. So that's quite a very different kind of attitude and culture. The administrative culture is not very compatible. New public management, decision-making style with consultation, collaboration, and participation, and a very pragmatic reform process combining old public administration, new public management, and these kind of whole-of-government initiatives. So it's not the case that the good old Bavarian bureaucracy is dead. It's still very much alive and kicking, but what we get is that we get new public management 1 minute, and post-new public management in additions. And this is making the public administration more complex and more hybrid. Conclusion, huh? Good. What can we see? I have to say that we are just in the starting phase of writing scientific articles and books on this material. So what we show now is some kind of a first digging into these kind of data. So a lot more will come out of this over the coming years. But what we see is that there is a moderate success regarding administrative reform in Europe. There is a potential for improvement, that's for sure. A lot of things is going on, but people are pretty uncertain about the effects and implication. And we see a more complex and hybrid administrative apparatus combining old public administration, new public management, and whole of government issues. There are big variations across countries. It's not a convergence going on. There is no convergence in Europe towards one model. There are very big differences between the contexts, and that means that the context is important, of course. A well-working bureaucracy is important. Less focus on cost-cutting and more on public involvement is probably necessary. And I think it would be wise if other European countries move towards the Scandinavian way of stronger managerial autonomy and less politicization. But of course, we need more research, and we need more in-depth evaluation, because what we have here is some kind of a scene from the top. That's one thing. And the other thing is that this is perceptions. This is their attitudes. It's not objective facts, actually. So we need to move more in the direction of getting more objective data about the effects and implication of the reforms. Of course, these kind of data have their drawbacks, but it's the first big European comparative project with a survey to top civil servants. So in that case, it's very interesting, I would say. Thank you.
And our next speaker today is Christian Frommelt. He is a research fellow at the Liechtenstein Institute, and his field is within the field of political science at the University of Innsbruck. And Mr. Frommelt has written widely in German and English, and amongst other things on the functions of the European Economic Area, on the issues of differentiated integration, and of course on Liechtenstein, and that's going to be his topic today, and his lecture is titled Liechtenstein Special Arrangement, a Small State Creative Solutions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and welcome you all to my lecture. First of all, I have to say it's not part of a big research project as the one before. It's more or less just a side product of another research project, but still, and it's also not that much comparative. It's more focused on Liechtenstein, but also might be give some inspiration to other states, especially the microstates, Andorra, San Marino, and Monaco, which are more at the moment also we are discussing about their European politics and their future in the European context. There are mainly two issues I would like to address today. First of all, how such a small state as Liechtenstein, which just 36,000 inhabitants, can cope with an EU acquis which currently covers over 6,000 EU acts. You know, we are a full member. Liechtenstein is a full member of the EEA. Is also a full member of Schengen and Dublin Agreement. So he has to cope with a lot of EU acts. And how can he do that? And the other one is how much flexibility can the EU offer to small state? You know, and this is this kind of special arrangements or tailor-made adaptations which are made for taking into account the smallness of a state. These are the two issues I would like to address. And as you probably all of you know, or as I've already mentioned before, we just have 35,000 inhabitants, and we have an administration which just has 1,700 people are employed there. And if you just take the 100% jobs, then it's even less, then it's just around 1,000. So it's tiny compared to other ones. Here I have Iceland or also some bigger states, and you can really see they have much more resources which are actually required to implement those international obligations. The other slide I would like to address here is just measuring the share of the total employment in public administration compared to the total employment in the country or the total population. And here you can see that, you know, Liechtenstein has not really a special high share of employment in public administration, especially not compared to the total employment in Liechtenstein. But when we were talking about downsizing, this is also a permanent issue in Liechtenstein. There's always a demand of downsizing the administration, because we're not like Norway that we love the state. There's also very high, it's not a lack of trust, but there's also a permanent criticism going on the size of the administration. But anyway, first of all, I would like to give you a few figures or facts which shows that Liechtenstein is actually doing well. There would be different possibilities to measure that. One is this kind of transposition deficit. This is published twice a year by the After Surveillance Authority and measures the percentage of directives, EU directives, which have not been implemented timely in the EFTA states, or it's also measured for the EU states. And here you can see that the transposition deficit is the lowest for Liechtenstein for the EFTA partners at the moment. It's just 1.0 and it's 3.2. There would be other indicators which give actually about the same measure, that Liechtenstein is doing pretty well, especially compared to Iceland and also compared to Norway. But a bit of different pictures we get from this here. And here I'm measuring, don't quote the numbers, this would require a bit more explanation. But what I would like to stress here is that I have counted all legal acts which are somehow related to a special or a tailor-made arrangement for Liechtenstein and also for the other states. And here you can clearly say that Liechtenstein has by far the highest number of legal acts which are somehow affected by those kind of adaptations. And Norway has the lowest one, the biggest one of these EAFTA partners. And we can also say something different. In addition, we have to say that the ones for Norway, they are always just, if Norway has somehow an opt-out or a derogation from an EU act, then also another EU state has one. So there's nothing, Norway's opt-outs, they don't really add a new opt-outs to the EU acquis. And this is completely different for Liechtenstein, and it's also a bit different for Iceland. The opt-outs that Liechtenstein got from the within the EA framework, they are completely new, and they just apply to Liechtenstein and not to the other EU states or EAFTA states. And it's just coming back to the numbers. It's quite huge. You know, that's around 40% of the EU of the EA relevant EU acquis is somehow linked to this kind of special arrangements within the EU. And this is one of my points, that we are doing well, but we are just doing well because we have these kind of special arrangements. But let us go a step back to see how we really administrate the EA or EA matters in Liechtenstein. And here I would like just to highlight this stuff here, that in the center there's this EA coordination unit which has 5 employees, all of them are lawyers, and they follow really a legal approach. And this is something special about Liechtenstein. And this is also why it is assigned to the Prime Minister and not to the Foreign Ministry as EA matters are in Norway or in Iceland. So it is the Prime Minister and not the Foreign Minister, and this is kind of an interesting thing. And we can't forget about the Parliament in European affairs, because they are not really involved. They are sometimes allowed to travel to Norway or to Brussels or to Iceland, but they are not really involved, which is a shame to some extent, but it's a fact. Here, the strategic objects of the European politics, that gets defined by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also somehow to some extent by the Parliament. But afterwards, you know, here, especially this is the core thing. This is the participation in the EFTA working groups or the EU committees, and this is run mainly by people who are working in the government agency or government office. So the approach that we are following is a very decentralized approach, that we delegate a lot of autonomy to the individual expert of the respective office, and he goes from Vaduz to Brussels and participates there without many instructions. And this is also something special here. So he doesn't have to, before he decides something, he doesn't have to report that to back home to Vaduz or to the mission to the EU in Brussels. So he has a lot of autonomy, and this is one of our core principles. And it's different in the other states because they have mostly policy-specific experts in Brussels, and they participate in those committees. I will skip that due to time reasons, and I will go just to the implementation. And here again, here it's the Parliament is also involved, but here you can also see that I have measured that and calculated all votes and amendments which have been made in legal bills which have an European impulse and which have had a domestic impulse, and there is a big difference. You know, European matters, they are not discussed that much, they are not that much amended, and here you can see that the core issue, there's a much more hierarchical governance regarding European affairs than domestic affairs. Here I'm providing some explanations why Liechtenstein is more or less efficient or better in governing European matters, and this is taken from the perspective of the administration itself. As I said before, this decentralized and selective approach. So as I said before, there's a high autonomy to the individual expert, and there is a clear list of areas of high interest and areas of no interest. So we have a very selective approach, say we go and are represented in this committee and not in this one. And there is also a strong continuity. There are legal experts which are for a very long time in the business, and they are also somehow advise others in regarding procedural aspects. And the last thing I would like to highlight here is we are not over ambitious. This is quite important. You know, we are not trying to make an impact. I've made a survey within all the within the whole administration and have compared the results to similar surveys in Norway. And here you can really see that for us, it is much more important to gain information to provide in the end a high implementation quality and not to have an impact or to bring in some new creative solutions. Then there are also some exogenous factors, which are not really part of the governance or which cannot be handled by the administration. And here it is clearly we have a hierarchical governance. But what I would like to highlight is this kind of favorable legal culture. I've made a lot of interviews recently here in Iceland, and this is something really different between Iceland and Liechtenstein, or also Norway and Liechtenstein. This monistic approach towards international law. What do I mean with this? In Liechtenstein, we don't have to implement regulations. They are directly applicable. And this is different to Norway and Iceland, where they have to implement them, and this makes some extra work. Another point is that our legal order or our legal tradition is strongly inspired by Austria and Switzerland, and so we can just look at them, what are doing they, and then take over or find a similar way than they do. And this is kind of also something which really helps to keep up this efficiency. And the last point is just a funny point in my view. If we implement something and there is no one, and there's no reason, no one who will really use this law, and we often do that because we are so small, there's no actual control, of this, whether the implementation has been correct or not. But this is obvious that, you can see that small states, they have far less complaints against European law because, it just get not applied. And you can see that also in the EU states. Anyway, there are types of special or tailor-made arrangements. And first of all, we can have a complete exemption. So an EU act doesn't apply to us, then there can be a time limit exemption so that we get time to make up some capacity building. And these are the most important things for me, this kind of outsourcing of the implementation. And this was the biggest share, if you consider the number again, this is the biggest share that we have that we said that we got this special arrangement by the EU that she says you don't have to implement those acts, but you have to guarantee that Swiss legislation or Austrian legislation, which has implemented or which is equal to those EU legislation, applies in Liechtenstein. So we have completely outsourced the implementation of legal acts to Switzerland, in most cases, or in some cases also to Austria, by making additional agreements with either the EU or with our partners like Switzerland and Austria. This is not very good for the sovereignty, but it is very good for the efficiency, and this is somehow a trade-off. And there's the other point is this kind of modular implementation. This is just something for the lawyers. We don't have to implement directives, a certain type of directives. They also are directly applicable in Liechtenstein, which is somehow also a unique situation in Liechtenstein. means, you know, here you can see we can have that, as I said before, in additional agreements, in protocols, but also with some specific adaptations within a joint committee decision. Those of you who are not that familiar with the EA acquis, you have to incorporate EU acts by a joint committee decision, and then you can make this kind of adaptations. Here's just a short point before I come to my conclusions. Sometimes it was, very rarely, but it was also the case that we have affected an EU act to set the threshold that high that we are not affected by that. That was kind of in statistics, for instance. If data is required, we just fall under the data threshold, and so the EU didn't have to make an adaptation for us. So there are other explanations, but there are also many explanations too regarding the smallness. And here I would like to say it's governance capacity, it's the small market size, it's geographical factors. There are also very different reasons where you can really put those special arrangements down to the smallness of the country. And here, just to come to the conclusions, first of all, to the first issue, it has helped us, those special arrangements have helped us to increase, to prevent an increase of the administrative resources and to keep up the efficiency of the governance. It has led to an increase of our vulnerability, and it has also weakened the legislative sovereignty. And finally, the poor size, you know, if you have a wider focus, the size of the administration might not be decisive whether an European state can integrate or can access the EU's internal market. And the EU has really shown some flexibility and ability to cope with smallness and smallness related factors. And finally, this is an assumption I would like to make, it's my personal view, the EA provides for more flexibility than the EU would provide for. I think this is also something which we have to mention. Then, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for your interest.
And this brings us to what in the program that I hope you have at hand, to what is called the second part of this, the agenda, small states and the EU. We have two speakers under this part of the agenda, and each one of them has 15 minutes to present their talk, 20 max. And then I will allow some time for questions, of course. First, I invite Caroline Grön. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen to deliver her lecture. She defended her dissertation in 2010. She has published widely in Danish and English on themes as diverse as playing Brussels right, Denmark's politics vis-à-vis the European Commission, youth and education, trust in management, and many more titles. Today, her lecture is titled Small States and the European Commission, Opportunities for Influence. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot for having me here today. I've been really looking forward to this, since this is, as you say, I have published on diverse issues. That is basically because I'm interested in the European Union and I'm interested in public administration. So that, of course, makes it very, very interesting for me to be here today. I'm going to talk about small member states and the European Commission. And basically I'm talking about a paper I have written that's called Playing Brussels Right. And this paper is a comparison of Denmark and Sweden and how these two member states and their administrations, thanks a lot, try to influence the European Commission. So basically there are two research questions that I'm interested in answering. The first one is, what does lobbying actually entail when we talk about dealing with the European Commission and we're talking about member states? I'll get back to that. That is connected to the theoretical interest that I'm pursuing. And secondly, what are the constraints and opportunities for small states in pursuing such a strategy? I've chosen to compare Denmark and Sweden, and I say it's an almost most similar case study. That is, of course, always one of the big challenges to do when you do a comparative design. But I'm comparing Denmark and Sweden, and I will be happy to talk more about the setup of the study, but if you want to hear more, but then please ask afterwards. I should perhaps just mention that the study is based on 32 interviews with civil servants in Brussels and in the capitals, as well as a survey among attachés, the ones employed on the permanent representations in Brussels, and with an N of 38. So there is, of course, some limitations to the quantitative material. I'm not going to show you too much of that today, but the quantitative and qualitative sources play together in this. All right. So what is the theoretical setup behind this study? Basically, I'm departing from what we could call a smart state approach, an argument I've been making with a colleague of mine, that in the European Union of the day, traditional small state strategies such as hiding and binding may not be the most intelligent strategies or smart for smaller member states to pursue. What we're arguing is that when you look at the institutional setup of the European Union, small states could behave in three ways where they sort of utilize the institutional structure of the European Union in a better way. They can act as self-interested mediators, they can act as norm entrepreneurs, and then what I will say something about today is that they can act as lobbyists. Now, lobbyists, that is usually something we call an actor who is not necessarily a state representative. What we have been arguing is that there are a lot of the tools used by lobbyists in Brussels that can easily be used by member states as well. And especially small member states may sometimes benefit from looking into these sort of more informal ways of pursuing influence in Brussels, exactly because that when you go into council meetings, they don't have that many votes. So to some extent, the lack of formal power can be set off by an intelligent use of informal channels of influence. What I argue is that when we approach this lobbying strategy, it can be usually informed by what we usually call exchange theory, a theory that basically points to interdependence between actors and point to the fact that usually actors exchange certain resources. And exchange is something that occurs when actors have resources that both parties would benefit from. What I more specifically argue is that you can look at information as such a resource, and you can look at different types of information which can be traded between actors when pursuing influence. And of course, in this paper in particular, and today I'm talking about the European Commission. So what is really interesting is to think about what are the sort of what is the framework in which an exchange with the Commission can occur. And here I ask three questions. First of all, when to establish an exchange. Now, first of all, before you can start exchanging information for influence, you basically need to know what is going on within the Commission. You need to know what kind of information they are in need of. Secondly, you need to identify who to engage with. The Commission is, it may not be as big as many national administrations, but it's still a rather big bureaucracy, and you need to know who to address. And finally, you need to know what to exchange, and that is where this resource perspective comes in. You can exchange technical information, you can help them figure out how to solve the technical issue within a piece of legislation. You can also provide information on national positions. It's important for the Commission to know if there are certain pieces of legislation that any particular member state would strongly object in Council. And finally, you can provide information about the European interest. You can provide information about solutions that would be beneficial to Europe at large, but you could perhaps also help them identify possible solutions that could create a majority in Council. All right. So that is the outset. And these were sort of the thoughts that I went into my empirical study with. Now, first of all, I was interested in knowing how these two member states identify opportunities for entering into an exchange. And I guess for both member states, it's very clear that they spend a lot of energy and resources trying to figure out what is actually going on within the Commission. The Commission has a work program, which is official and very easily accessible. But of course, a lot of things are prepared in the Commission, which is not necessarily described in the work program, which comes out of other needs and contexts. So these two member states, Denmark and Sweden, both have strategies for surveying the formal channels, but it differs very much between policy areas how this is done. Expert committees under the Commission is another way of obtaining this kind of information. Now, the Commission gather expert committees in many, many different areas where national experts meet up on occasion in Brussels and discuss issues that Commission asks them to discuss. And quite often, before the Commission starts revising legislation, they will go to these expert committees and tell them, we're considering doing this or that. Could you give us your input? Now, quite often, these experts, they are situated in agencies in the capital, so they're not part of the political machinery very close to the minister of the political level in ministries. And that can sometimes cause some problems, because what you need to is basically you need to have an expert who is very, very deeply involved with the work in a very small, extremely technical area. This guy, he goes to Brussels, he gets information about what the Commission is planning, and then you have to get him to go back to the capital and actually tell the ones who can tell the permanent representation what is going on within the Commission. Now, this is a clear, Pierre, I talked about coordination before, that was between different levels of government, but this is also really a coordination issue. And what we see when we compare Denmark and Sweden is that the fact that the Swedish agencies have a very high degree of autonomy actually sometimes hinder this communication between different levels of government. So what is basically the point here is that there can be really important information which should be flowing between experts, political civil servants, and permanent representations in Brussels, which can sometimes be cut off. And before we talked about the capacity issues in small public administrations, I would have to say that this is perhaps where a smaller public administration would have an advantage in the fact that it can be tighter knit together than a bigger one. Furthermore, at the permanent representations, attachés will participate in a lot of meetings in Council where they will meet Commission officials. And when we asked in our survey these attachés where they talk to Commission officials, Council meetings is the most popular venue overall because they're already there, they drink coffee, they talk about what is going on. And that is, of course, an important part of this game to understand that a lot of the informal chit-chat that is going on is actually extremely valuable, and it's important that you're there to participate in this informal exchange of information. Of course, member states also make direct contact with the Commission all the time, with desk officer level, at head of unit level, and so on. But the problem with this approach is that you need to know who to contact, and I'll get back to that. Then finally, member states, of course, have own nationals in the Commission, and they have seconded national experts. I think anecdotal evidence suggests that member states vary quite substantially in the way they use their seconded national experts. I guess both Denmark and Sweden say that they're not very sort of sophisticated in the way that they communicate with seconded national experts in the Commission. There seems to be some differences between Denmark and Sweden in the extent that they call upon their own nationals within the Commission to provide information. But for both member states, it's a fact that they don't really have that many employed in the Commission to call. Both member states' representatives say when I ask them that if you call somebody of your own nationality, it's easier to communicate. Basically, one of them said, well, it's like you don't have to go through the first lunch where you get to know people because you have the same nationality, you can just go ahead and ask them stuff. That's very practical, but there are also some clear limitations for small member states. Basically, the fact that there aren't that many Danes in the Commission to call up. So basically, we can say when we look at this, they are actually behaving quite smart. They're also quite similar, but they are facing resource constraints. It takes a lot of time, to go around, build up networks, having coffee with people. It might sound enjoyable, but it's a lot of hard work. And Also, the Swedes are a bit more challenged in ensuring that information actually flows between different levels of government. It's not that it's not a challenge in Denmark, but it's even harder for the Swedes. Okay. Now, secondly, of course, they need to identify who to engage with within the Commission. And they need to find out what is the right channel. Now, that may be that the right place to go with your input is the unit drafting a given proposal. Early on in the process, that will almost always be a good approach. Contact the desk officer who's actually writing the piece of legislation, and explain him or her your concerns. Somebody of same nationality, as somebody once explained it to me, well, you know, if you go and talk to a Dane, you have this whole you're meeting somebody who has a basic understanding of Danish society and who will hence be more perceptible to arguments as to why something is good or bad in the Danish case. So basically there is also, of course, an important element that if you can find somebody of your own nationality, that is easy. When we asked in the questionnaire and looked at the statistics on this particular issue, it seemed that the Swedes were a bit more optimistic about the positive effect of talking to a Swede than the Danes were. And I guess when you talk to the Danes, there is a general perception that other member states are better at using their own nationals than the Danes are. I don't know if you would ask other member states if they would say the same. All the other ones are better at using their own nationals than we are, but it's at least something that I hear repeatedly when I talk to the Danes, that perhaps the Danish administrative culture with loyal civil servants who are not politicized, it's something that plays against an active use of civil servants in interest of their own member state. Finally, as proposals move along the Commission hierarchy, they will end up in cabinets or commissioners' meetings. And at this point, it's important to be aware that at the final stages of decision-making within the Commission, it's very difficult to change things. It's very difficult and costly to activate your commissioner. Commissioners don't have that many opportunities for saying, this is something that my member state would not like. First of all, commissioners do not refer to their own member state. They refer to the member state I know best, because they're not supposed to represent national interests. But I interviewed a previous Danish commissioner, and she said that during her 5 years in the Commission, there was only one time she had actually got a case taken off the Commission agenda. It was something about the content of a certain substance in sausages. And it wasn't even completely taken out of the Commission work program. It was just postponed. Now that was how hard she could push for Danish particular interest as a commissioner. And you have to understand that when you look at the importance of national commissioners, it is important, but there is a clear limit to what they can actually do in the final stages of preparing a piece of legislation. At this time and space, it's also very much a question of the political capital you want to use. Do you want to fly in your minister to take a meeting with the responsible commissioner? Do you want to have your permanent secretary go and meet with the director general? It's a different game we're playing here, and it's much more political. And of course, that can be a very strong signal sending to the Commission as a member state that this is something that really, really bothers us. That's why we're sending the minister. But it also takes a minister who actually wants to go to Brussels. And it is, of course, also a little bit risky if you don't succeed in pushing that kind of pressure. So when we look at the data, we see that the Swedes are actually a bit more willing to do so. They send their permanent representatives, their EU ambassadors, more often into the field. They're more willing to engage their politicians, and they're more willing to put political pressure. And you discussed it with the Danes. They say, well, you know, we're a small member state. We shouldn't cause too much of a hassle. And in that sense, there may be some identity differences between Denmark and Sweden to the extent that they actually perceive themselves as small players in the EU, which would be interesting to investigate further. Finally, the question of what are they exchanging then when they get to actually do an exchange. And as I said before, you can exchange different types of resources. You can exchange technical resources, giving input to legislation. And when you ask the attachés and the civil servants, they all say, if you can do that, that is definitely the most efficient way to try to influence a piece of legislation, if you can help them write it, if you can help them make better legislation. However, this is very costly for member states because they have to assign civil servants in the capital to actually work on the technical sides of proposals. And this means that quite often member states will just go to the Commission and say, this is the position of my member state. Now I've said it, you've heard it, bye-bye. And when we ask them to evaluate the efficiency of this, they clearly say, well, you know, this is not the most efficient way if you want to influence legislation, but it is when you look at the resource constraints faced by member states. And if we look at this now, it's better for you than it is for me, luckily. If you compare the arguments used and the evaluation of the effect of different arguments, you can clearly see that the argument that it will make a dossier more acceptable to a particular member state is widely used but not deemed very efficient, whereas the others are actually deemed more efficient but not used as often. And that is clearly an example of the resource constraint that small member states are facing, because if they had unlimited administrative resources back home, they would probably be able to pursue a more efficient strategy. All right, so the conclusions, I know I don't have much time to go. What are the lessons for small states? Well, I guess, first of all, it's very important to state that resources, that is basically a key constraint if you want to act as a smart state and lobby the Commission. Because you have to invest in technical input into the legislative process, and that really is something that takes out of a lot of resources. Organization at home matters. It matters how you ensure information flows between different levels of government. And what we see is that these things are typically organized according to national tradition and not as much according to what would be most efficient for pursuing national interests in Brussels. Own nationals in the Commission hold potential, but with the point being made very clearly that there aren't that many nationals for smaller member states. And then finally, I guess when I started out doing this survey, I was really intrigued by the fact that when you talk to the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they kept on talking about themselves as a small state, and that small states have to behave in a certain ways, and small states can't do this and that, and Germany can have 90 points to a given dossier, and Denmark can only have 1, stuff like that. And then when you go to Sweden, they say, well, you know, we weren't happy about this piece of regulation, so we went to the Commission and said, if you don't change that, we will go into enhanced cooperation and we'll just leave you behind. And I was like, what? And as I said, I thought I was doing a most similar case study. So basically, I guess there's also an important point to be made that small states can perceive themselves in different ways, which can form what they perceive as acceptable behavior in Brussels quite substantially. Thank you very much.
So our second speaker in this part of the program is Roderick Pace. He is a professor of European Studies at the University of Malta, and he has published widely in English on issues related to Malta, but also what I found interesting was on secularization in Catholic societies, democratization of Southern Europe and the Mediterranean, parliamentary diplomacy, and other issues. So today he will be talking, and the title of his talk is Working Within the EU, the Case of Malta. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
First of all, may I express my happiness of being here again. I mean, I came from one island in the Mediterranean to another island, and islands always make me feel good, even if the weather is a bit different. So, and I also like to thank the Center for Small States for inviting me here to give this presentation. Well, actually, I'm going to focus more on the empirical, on the experience, rather in the true meaning of the word empirical than theory, because I thought this is going to be a very short presentation, so I have no time to go about theorizing a lot on our experience. Which one? Is it this one? Okay. Now, I started off with an image of our capital city, Valletta, which is a world city, but I won't let you. I'll tell you the story if I have some time why I put that there. And this is how it looks from another angle there, which shows you what great transformations have taken place. Before, that area full of yachts there was full of battleships from the Mediterranean fleet of Britain. So, if I have to look at the first, make a broad assessment of what our experience of the first decade, which happens precisely this year, of membership is, I think broadly speaking, it has been positive. The expectations have been positive ones have been fulfilled. Most of the negative outcomes have not been fulfilled. And Malta has coped reasonably well with membership. Very, very quickly, we have joined the Euro in 2008, and we were capable of an orderly transition to the Euro, where we kept a tight control of prices before we changed over to the Euro. We also have liberalized our economy from 2004 onwards. There has been full liberalization, and we strengthened the independence of the central bank, privatized the dockyards, which were one of the biggest industrial sector, which was the one most problematic since the 1960s, and free movement of labor, that is, more foreigners are working in our economy than before, and the Maltese economy has largely unaffected by the financial crisis. These are some of the achievements, broad achievements. If we look at the GDP per capita, we started off with a GDP per capita which was below that of Cyprus, Greece, Portugal, and Slovenia. And we are now in 2013, this is the last statistics available, above the countries we've overtaken: Cyprus, Greece, Portugal, and Slovenia. Of course, these are countries which have experienced problems as well. If we look at the employment rate, 2004, we have had 57.9% of the population was employed, and unemployment 77.2%. In 2014, we are 64.9% and 6.8% unemployment as of now. But we still have to reach that famous target of the 2020 target, which is 75% of the population employed. If we look at the employment by gender, there you are again. The male unemployment is still huge, but has declined relatively to the female employment in the labor force, which has gone up from 34 to 49.8%, and I think that is quite an achievement for us. What are the challenges ahead? We have to increase our R&D. We have to achieve at least 40%. 33% is our Malta target of 30 to 34-year-olds who have completed tertiary education. We have to reduce the rate of early school leavers, and we have to increase the share of renewables in final energy consumption. By 2014, we are way to correcting a slight fiscal deficit. We have to strengthen the independent institutions to monitor public finances, reform the healthcare system. We have a very good healthcare system, but very expensive one, which is, has problems of long-term sustainability. And we have to accelerate pension reform because our population is aging rapidly. And we have to continue to increase the efficiency of the public procurement and some other sectors, including the judicial system, by ensuring a timely and efficient implementation of planned judicial reform. Now, where do we go on the implementation of directives? Pending infringement procedures, Malta has only 12 as compared to 30 for the EU average. The transposition deficit is only 0.1 as compared to the 0.7 for the rest of the EU. What is very impressive is the transposition delay in months, which is about 19.2, where the EU average is 7.3. So we tend to really take our directive implementation to the wire, but we really managed to do a lot and do it well, it seems. How has, again, politics, joining the EU affected our political system? Well, basically, since 2004, we have an end of Euroscepticism in Parliament, in the sense that whereas before the country was neatly divided in two, with the Labour Party supporting against membership and the Nationalist Party, the only two parties in government supporting membership. Now we have, again, agreement, cross-party, bipartisan agreement on the on the EU. There is a solid national consensus. It is estimated that those who are still reject the EU are hover between 12 and 18% of the population. The European elections, according to studies that we are performing at the moment, have also helped to change the domestic political setting. We have also seen shifts on neutrality. The constitutionally enshrined neutrality of Malta is being debated in our country, although no concrete steps have been taken so far to change the definition of neutrality in our constitution. We are also seeing that Malta is participating fully in key EU military and civilian peace operations. We have, of course, participated in the task force in Somalia by sending 14 troopers aboard a Netherlands ship. We are also in the EU training mission in Somalia, in Uganda, and the monitoring mission in Georgia. And we have also participated in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We have joint partnership for peace again in 2010 date. And if you look at something which is very important about the elections, this is a political point I wanted to show you. Our elections, 2004 and 2009, have gone against the ruling party in government, which is very strange in our political system, because what we had here was that the 2003, for example, the Nationalist Party was elected to government with a reasonable majority. 2004, it loses the election to the Labour Party. It does so again 2010 date, which is not shown here. The national election is won by the Nationalists, but the European election is won by the Labour Party. And in 2014, we see again the seats have grown from 5 to 6, thanks to the Lisbon Treaty, which is the minimum number of seats for small countries, and these are shared equally 3-3 by the Nationalists and the Labour Party being in government. What is much more important is the introduction. It has always been a problem for us to have participation of women in politics. This has been one of our greatest challenge, to try to promote the participation of women in our politics. But you see in the European elections what has transpired is that we start off with a completely male-dominated group being elected to the European Parliament. Then we shift to 3-3 in 2009 as a result of some MEPs, 3 MEPs in fact, resigning and contesting the national election. And then we go to 2014, where more female candidates are elected directly and immediately than male candidates, which I think is a clear sign that the ground has begun to shift here in the gender participation in the elections. Now, political changes. both the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition today are former MEPs. So in a sense, the European Parliament, this is something that we are analyzing to see over time what happens here, because this is too early to make any useful conclusions. But whereas in most national parliaments, national MPs, when they reach retirement, they seek some other job in the EU institutions. In our case, it has been that the European Parliament influence is coming very much into our national system. And 2 ministers are former MEPs. Parliament has begun to model its work on the European Parliament by the use of more committees, which have been established since 1995. The challenges of the Foreign and European Affairs Committee, which is a parliamentary committee which scrutinizes EU legislation, particularly for the subsidiarity test, is that it has a lack of personnel and 8 weeks normally to complete its scrutiny and to report to the Commission in case of some objections on the basis of subsidiarity. The advantages of this are that it has greater links as members of the EU to the Maltese Parliament with the European Parliament and EU national parliaments. As a result of this, we have strengthened our links in the past with the national parliaments and the European parliaments. Another political change which has come out of membership in the public sector has been the introduction of specialized authorities, some of which I am indicating here, which also have a lot of internal EU expertise. The symbiosis, as I call it, between the public sector and these agencies is very hard to simplify, but it's there. It is a complex symbiosis where there is a continuous exchange of views, opposition and cooperation between these authorities. But let us remember that these authorities have accumulated a lot of human expertise and capital, which are often very important in securing the Maltese position, in a sense that they can also help advise government. They oppose it when it is not implementing the European directives the proper way, but government can call on their expertise when it is trying to handle a dossier. So there is this kind of relationship within these organizations, which is also very helpful. We have 6 MEPs in the European Parliament. One of the greatest difficulties there is that these 6 MEPs cannot participate in all the committees of the European Parliament. However, they do cooperate a lot amongst themselves, and at times they also are cooperating with government on key issues, because the European Parliament, as you know, has important and strong legislative powers. Maltese ministers attend the council meetings, the Prime Minister also the European Council, and this is a place where they, of course, strike the bonds of friendships with their fellow ministers and MPs. But, however, the most important thing is that the permanent representation in Brussels, which is just walking distance from the Commission. I mean, you just have to cross the road and you are in the Commission. It's probably one of the closest permanent representations to the European Commission building at the Bailey-Mo. And the officials who travel from Malta every week, we call it the bus to Brussels. It sets off at about 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the evening, comes back at 7 with the return crowd. So every day there is this shuttle service with Brussels, and here is where we connect with the various working parties, committees, and task forces. I don't think the Maltese have a sense of being small, therefore we are weak, therefore we have to be quiet. I think Maltese culture is a bit much more different in this sense. We have been taught, wrongly so, of course, I think, that we are invincible. We have, if you read our history books, we are the people who resisted two great sieges. So when we go to Brussels, we go in a sense of, all right, now let's see what these big guys are going to try to do to us, and let's see how we are going to outwit them. There are various other committees and bodies which are set up in Malta, where there is a lot of expertise. Let me stress before I end, lest I run out of time, I'm already running out of time, that one of the key investments that you have, that countries, small countries like ours, have to invest in are, first of all, personnel. My institute has trained more than 600 graduates in European studies who have gone then to further postgraduate work, both in Malta and overseas. And they are an asset today, both in the European Commission and in the institutions, in the bureaucracy, or in the European institutions and in government. We have a large rate of turnover. I think many of our Brussels officials do not stay there a long time. I can't tell you why, but they all blame the weather. They say they are very. After a while, after 2-3 years, they want to return back home to the tennis courts, to the blue sky, the yachts, you know. And I mean, you can understand this. But this is now lost. They come back, they bring their expertise, and although, of course, European Commission officials are meant to be, their loyalty, their first loyalty is to the institutions, and that is where it is. But they can help you to show you the direction. In a sense, listen, I mean, instead of going round in circles, just even if they don't become involved in the problem themselves, they at least can tell you, listen, they point to the directions. This talk this lecture is a lecture without an end. So I will end it here, and thank you all for listening to me. But I've cut it short, but it's to your benefit, I can assure you.